Wow. If you lead as stressful a life as I do, this talk was seriously stress-inducing. It might just be the straw that broke the camel's back in my case. It's like the case of the hypochondriac who says, my hypochondria worries me. I was particularly concerned about the bit about the effects on the hippocampal volume of jet lag.
I was thinking of it.
I hope there's some other part of the body proportionately grows to compensate for tiny little hippocampus. Which leads me to psychoanalysis, but I'll come back to that. This thing of compensatory organ growth and diminution reminds me, I was living in London at the time that famous study on hippocampal volume of the British cab drivers was done, and I know I've told a few of you this before, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself. It's my little hippocampus. But after the study, the cabbies were all so excited, they're proud of their hippocampi, and sort of, they're not great on reading science journals generally, but all of them knew about this finding, and they were telling every passenger who would care to listen. And then on April Fool's Day, after that paper came out, there was an article in one of the British papers saying that there was another study that was done on the brains of the British cabbie drivers, and what it had discovered is that proportionate to the enlargement of the part of the brain responsible for spatial memory, there was a diminution of the part of the brain responsible for political philosophy. Turning to my job, by the way, is just to introduce the discussion, and then we have question time. Turning to slightly, not slightly, I suppose more sort of serious reflections on your presentation. I was, as you were going through some of the symptoms of stress, sort of chronic stress, being overwhelmed, exhausted, anxious, irritable, out of control, frustrated, low mood, cognitive decline, and so on. I was reminded of the syndrome of neurasthenia described in the 19th century, which has pretty much those kinds of symptoms and signs, and remembering that around that time, sort of the start of the Industrial Revolution and the great change in our social organization, which we're still living through the consequences and continued developments of, that around that time, neurasthenia was quite widely attributed to the stresses and strains of what was considered modern life. And they referred to how fast cars were going, and trains and these big engines, and how frightening it all was, and how everything was so unpredictable. And it makes me wonder, and I mean it seriously, although I also don't want to reduce an extremely complex matter to such a simple aspect of it. But it makes me wonder, and maybe you'd be willing to sort of reflect on that for us in response. When you showed that cover of the book about why the zebras don't get stressed, I thought, shit, it must be quite grim being a zebra. There are lions and whatnot around in zebra land, and yet we're the ones who get stressed. And it's something, and reflecting on that in relation to this neurasthenia and to the explanations that were given, and it's the nature of modern life, and makes me wonder, perhaps all of the freedoms that we've won for ourselves as we've transcended our biological status, which in some ways must surely be progress. Maybe not. It's all of this loss of even the rigid social order of the old regimes in Europe. Has come at a price. You speak of the social hierarchies and the social dominance aspects, which seem to be a very big part of the cascades that you were talking about. So that's just a little reflection on neurasthenia and on the price of our freedoms and the benefits of our democracies and so on. At what price does it come? It's really not a scientific matter, but because you link this work that you've done with these general social factors, I think it gives pause for thought. It was extremely refreshing and extremely impressive to listen to a presentation by one of the world's great scientists and one of your nation's great scientists. Really detailed, sustained body of work on highly technical aspects of basic neuroscience, linking his findings and the findings of your colleagues in such an effortless way with things which we can all relate to about our lives. And I really felt very impressed and very kind of exhilarated by that things happening in basic neuroscience are so once you've reached the level of understanding and sort of overarching synthesis that you have, that you can see these links. Everyone recognizes things about their own everyday life and things which in a very practical way you can do something about. I, for example, am going to go for a jog straight after this. So thank you very much for that. And not only thank you, but also it's one worries at times about what the relevance is of what we do in our laboratories and so on. And I think it's a matter of accumulation of knowledge, and then eventually the bigger picture appears, and it's as I say, very reassuring to see that. To end my introduction to our discussion, I must, of course, given where we are, say something about psychoanalysis. And the obvious point of contact between what Professor McEwen has said and our own way in psychoanalysis of looking at things. And again, going back to the history, starting with neurasthenia and whatnot, Freud, as I've pointed out to you, by reminding you that at the time of in the late 19th century, when neurasthenia reared its head, perhaps for the very reasons we've been talking about, it wasn't Freud, it wasn't his great insight to recognize that stress is bad for you, that adverse life events are bad for you, that environmental factors influence health. I think psychoanalysts sort of tried to claim all of that for this guy, who I think is there. There he is over there. But that wasn't really his specific contribution. What Freud's contribution was, and also, by the way, that line of thought. I mean, as you well know, just to remind all of us, that line of thought through canon and so on. There's been a whole trajectory through the 20th century of understanding in an entirely unpsychoanalytical way, entirely independent of the whole psychoanalytical tradition, of gradually understanding and gradually pinning down in a kind of causal mechanistic set of models how these stressful events impact through our brains on our bodies, and how this kind of idea that this beginning to transcend the mind-body dichotomy and beginning to make sense of what appeared to be quite spooky and mysterious. How could feelings affect your bodily health and so on? It's all now sort of quite perspicacious and lucid and easily understood, and doesn't really require any of the gymnastics of the psychoanalytical way of thinking about things, which leads to, again, this when we speak of stressful life events and the brain mechanisms, the central mechanisms that you so eloquently sort of summarized for us, and how these in turn relate to bodily health, touches, of course, on this ancient mind-body problem. And there too I start thinking, well, so this is not really the stuff that psychoanalysis was about, and is this really the mind that Professor McEwen is talking about? It's not really a dichotomy, brain to body. It's all body. And that's what makes it so possible to come up with scientific formulations of how it all works. And the problem with psychoanalysis is the mind part of it in the sort of first-person sense of being in the world. And so this leads me to the question I want to conclude with, which is that for Freud, what Freud did, he made a dichotomy all those years ago, very, very early on, 1896, between neurasthenia and the neuroses proper. Neurasthenia was this kind of quantitative thing. He understood it as not really being amenable to psychological treatment. It wasn't something that needed understanding. It had to do with the kind of allostatic load within his own way of thinking. For him, of course, it had to do with the sexual accumulations of sexual tensions and releases of sexual tensions, which in some indirect way must be related to the things you're talking about, because if everything else is working, you end up being able to bonk somebody. You've sort of sufficiently succeeded in everything else. But the point is that for Freud it wasn't mental. It was much, I think, along the lines that Freud's word for it was economic, quantitative. It had to do with degrees of something physiological, let's put it that way, rather than content-based, rather than to do with experience and qualities of particular types of relation to objects and whatnot. And it was that sort of thing that he felt was necessary to unpick in the individual case in regard to the neuroses proper, what he called the transference neuroses, and hysteria and obsessional neurosis and all these things which now have different names, but we all know what I'm talking about. So the question for me is there anything, what would be even more exhilarating and thrilling than where we stand now, as summarized in this sort of panoramic way by you today, would be are we beginning to bridge that gulf, that divide, from the quantitative aspects of stress and allostatic load to something more qualitatively differentiable in terms of what kinds of stresses, what kinds of particular types of mishap in our living of our lives and our perception of our place in the family and in society and so on, which in psychoanalysis is all theorized in terms of things like the Oedipus complex, where do I fit in the hierarchy and how do I get beyond where I am now and so on. All of those things with all these old names that Freud came up with, but it was really a serious attempt to grapple with, I think, this thing which still remains for us, which is there some specific type of stress, for example, that causes depression in particular? Is it stress, depression, and also stress cardiovascular disease and stress blah blah? I think that if the question is, are we beginning to be able to differentiate these different types of stressors, different types of constellations, obviously mediated by specific brain systems. It's not suddenly spooky. I think the possibility of us being able to do that would really bridge that divide in a way that would give us a complete, a medicine that really incorporates being in the world within physical medicine. It seems to me we're bloody close to being there. So, all credit to you, and thank you very, very much for a brilliant presentation.
Really wonderful, thoughtful remarks. The thing that I came away with thinking about first, why are zebras and human beings different? I think it obviously has something to do with our higher cortical development, which I think gives us the wonderful possibilities of human beings in terms of creativity, but also brings upon us a sense of, shall we say, responsibility. That you can't do it all with a pill. We have to take matters into our own hands in terms of our own behavior and our society's behavior, which we'd like to pass it off to somebody else, find that there's a pill for depression or a pill for this or a pill for that. And I think what it comes down to for me is a sense of a person's own self-esteem and locus of control. And getting a person to be able to improve that and have a sense that they want to do something for themselves and then beyond that, want to do something for society as a whole, is the whole, essence, I think, of personal and societal activities. And there's so often, of course, people are unable to do that, unable or unwilling to do that. So we represent as human beings the best possible and the worst possible, as we've seen recently with some of the recent events. But I think getting that sense of control, instilling in a person is a very key element of all of this. And this, of course, may hark back to early life events, which has deprived people of that ability. And the question is, can you reinstate that in some way? I would like to believe, as a neuroscientist, that if you could find a way of doing it, that maybe it will enlarge the hippocampus and change a number of other brain circuits that could, help people deal with their lives better. But that's a tall word. So.
Again, linking back to the field that this building represents, I suppose that's what they try to do in psychoanalytical treatment, is to try to, they call it ego strength, trying to gain some sense of knowledge of your own mental health and gaining some sort of control. I'm going to give the first question to Jaak Panksepp. I just want to point out that he is back in the land of the living. He got a... As most of you know, he's had a serious illness and has even more serious treatment for it, and he's now in full remission.
Thanks a lot. I'll try to keep my stress level down. One way to keep it down is keep it up in other people. So. Let me follow up on that beautiful essay on so many years of wonderful work and thinking. Let me just go pointedly to the question that Mark was ending with. So many influences come down into the pituitary adrenal axis, and the classic one is very well studied. In your first slide, you had vasopressin coming down, and we know that oxytocin is stress responsive. And, the analysis of what's happening in the body is so much easier in a way because those are traditional medical tools. The analysis that goes up into the brain-mind is much more difficult, and one sort of has to look into a crystal ball at this time. How would you see the future parsing this very global concept of stress into a more resolved picture of what's coming down in the various systems in the brain? For instance, what is driving vasopressin more than CRF, and et cetera, et cetera? What's your thoughts on it?
Well, since you mentioned oxytocin, and since the slide with me and my dog is still up there, I'm aware of some very interesting studies that show when owners interact with their dogs, the oxytocin levels in the blood of both, in the urine of both, go up. And there is certainly evidence that you know very well that oxytocin does have very potent anti-stress effects, and it's a factor that probably is involved in many of the kinds of therapies, whether it's pet therapy or interactions with people in a very compatible environment that actually helps to reduce the physiologic burden. And we also know that there are some successful attempts, or beginnings of successful attempts, to use oxytocin even intranasally to try to treat anxiety, depressive type disorders. Which then gets back to this notion of sort of balance and expanding the notion of the network of allostasis. One should begin to build in other factors. The parasympathetic, of course, is one of the more neglected aspects of autonomic function, and in terms of neuroendocrine function, the oxytocin part of the story would be, I think, one of those to be put into it. And I think that the note, if we built a true network of allostasis it would include so many things that it would just fill up the screen. And we have to start somewhere, but I think one of the first places I'd start is by putting in the, including the oxytocin system. Maybe we can work on a diagram together, actually, would be great.
I think the oxytocin thing is such an exciting item on the horizon, but I mean, we spent a lot of time seeing whether oxytocin was affectively positive, and it will not produce condition-place preference on its own. And then we have the last issue of biological psychiatry, that intranasal oxytocin increases envy and schadenfreude. Loading. Now this throws a real monkey wrench into all of that.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's going to be much more subtle and maybe requires psychoanalysis after all.
The next question is Dr. Maggie Zollner.
Thank you. Oh, Dr. Ewan, if you can just hit the mouse pad for a minute so we'll get the image back. Thank you. So along the lines of what Mark was talking about, so what I was thinking about was in psychoanalysis, we think about in the process of the attachment relationship, children develop mental representations of the self and the other, and that those are very important in affect regulation, right? So that when you're doing something, you're taking a risk, you either have access to an image, let's say of your mother, who's going to accept you no matter what the outcome is, or you might have an image of a mother who's going to punish you for even trying, or punish you for failing, and so on. So there's a very important sort of inner world that's managing stress as well. And I think that the complicated thing is that when children are growing up in abusive or neglectful situations, or with narcissistic or depressive parents and so on, the stressful context is affecting the infrastructure, a lot of the things that you were talking about, and it's also affecting those important mental contents. So I was wondering if you could say anything about the neural circuitry that might be involved with sort of accessing those mental representations out of awareness as we sort of assess what we're going to do or not do in response to the world. If you have any ideas about what that might be.
Well, very crudely, the way I think about it is that of course, the downstream influence of what we refer to as the prefrontal cortex is enormous. The studies of Steve Mayer on the learned helplessness phenomenon, when there's inadequate downstream control, there's a greater sense of helplessness in an animal model. The control of impulsive behavior, the executive functions, these of course are not necessarily all in the same circuit, but it's the same general circuit, and probably part of a system that communicates within itself. The downstream control of amygdala activity, the whole idea of, which is now sort of in the notion of post-traumatic memories, can we suppress them? Can we reactivate them and get rid of them? Or are they always there? And is the best way to recondition them with other associations that allow for more constructive responses to them when they come back to haunt us? And this is a very active area of study now, both in the field of memory, but also in the area of traumatic stress disorder. And so again, I think picking out the three areas that we did, not ignoring that the rest of the brain is there as well. Certainly the prefrontal cortex and amygdala play a very important role in terms of fear-related memories recall. These memories are probably there and not really easy to get rid of, but can be reconditioned, reconsolidated. And I think that concept then could be applied to a lot of things that you're talking about. And it also then, I think one thing I meant to emphasize after Mark's remark is that I think we are now coming back to the realization that psychotherapies and cognitive therapies are essential, even if we have pharmaceutical agents that help to control emotions. They're essential as part of the treatment of all of these disorders we're talking about. They're a classic example of what antidepressant drugs do by themselves if they have no cognitive increasing anxiety levels, and perhaps the state of motivation of a person who's been very lethargic, who might go out and commit suicide unless they have somebody to actually help guide them in a more constructive direction. So I think the beauty of knowing that the brain is plastic not only to hormones and to things like stress, but to things like enriched environments and many other, gives new hope that we can define better therapies. In fact, one of the slides, if I put in, these by the way are a couple of PDFs on the science of child development, which I'd be glad to share with anybody, and also how it translates into policy. The thing from our MacArthur network on reaching for a healthier life, California newsreel, Unnatural Causes, which was aired in October, unfortunately not in the New York area, but is a wonderful documentary on inequality and how it affects health. And then this study, which was a study in chronic fatigue syndrome, which is one of the more vexing problems that the medical system doesn't seem to be able to deal with, showing high allostatic load. But then more interesting from our present discussion is that if you could find a successful behavioral therapy that works, and you do a longitudinal study of the brain, they found an increase in prefrontal gray matter volume in people who successfully responded to therapy. Now that's good news because the brain is changing and the prefrontal cortex is perhaps strengthening its ability to do whatever it's doing. The vexing problem is that you got to find out a therapy that works for an individual, and that's the hard part that all of you are facing, is what works for a particular individual and why won't it work for somebody else. But that's, I think, the challenge that we have, because we're just simply not going to find drugs that are going to do it all. They may help do the job, but they have to be combined with sophisticated therapies.
Dr. Michael Crook.
Thanks for the very rich presentation. I think that the material you shared with us is really fundamental to both psychiatry and psychoanalysis. I wanted to suggest that there seems to be a terrible decline in detailed history taking outside of the circles where people are psychoanalytically oriented. And when you consult to a residential treatment center and get reports from a variety of sources, and we look upon as the history seems to have been replaced by a kind of diagnostic impression followed by a string of medications that have been attempted to help the individual. So I think that the confluence of psychoanalytic thought and the neurophysiologic matrix that you're describing are kind of a natural bond. I wanted to ask a more specific question. As a spin-off of this kind of reductio ad absurdum of diagnosis and treatment that we seem to be rushing toward in non-analytic circles, there is an enormous use of atypical antipsychotics in children and in adolescents, and usually under some kind of rubric of some variation of bipolar disorder, which seems to me to be arrived at rather promiscuously diagnostically. And one of the effects of these atypical psychotics, which these children are on for years and years and years and years, is obesity and type 2 diabetes. So you have the kind of conflictual circumstance in which, in an attempt to reduce the child's stress and improve their adaptive performance, you're basically sentencing them to a aberrant physiology for an indefinite period of time, a period of time when the brain is growing. So I just wanted to share that and see what sort of response it elicited from you.
I think this is, I'm glad you brought it up. It's an example of one of the unintended consequences of a chemical treatment for something, which, in the same sense as when one is giving Ritalin and kids who don't necessarily need it are, who could just as well be given more regular physical activity to burn off some of their energy. I mean, it's this kind of thing. There may be a better way to treat this that doesn't involve a chemical that has a side effect. And all these pharmaceutical agents, one way or the other, have side effects. I mean, you kill yourself with aspirin, and Vioxx is an example. So I think we need these chemicals, but we probably, as your remarks indicate, we rely too much on the quick and easy fix, and then we have to, so a kid that has this diabetes or that obesity, would you start then treating them with statins and with other chemicals in order to counteract that, or with diet, reducing drugs, things like that. And people often get themselves into this chemical fix of having so many chemicals and so many side effects that are working, in ways that we don't fully understand. So somehow I think we have to, while, using the drugs that work and are essential in many cases for certain conditions, begin to look for alternate ways to deal with these problems, which are probably much more difficult because they may involve more person hours in dealing with them on an individual basis, and people don't always have time to do that, so they look for the quick and easy way out.
Yes, Dr. Maurice Crater.
Thanks very much for a fantastic talk. I'm going to ramble for a few seconds. The proximate cause why zebras might be less anxious or not anxious, although I don't know the details of the literature, might be that they're running all the time. Running is, in some small but interesting studies, considered the treatment for panic, depression, and those things. Now, perhaps the reason running helps with panic might be that there is a connection that we've been studying between panic and endogenous opiates. And I would like to hear a little bit about what you think might be relevant or not relevant in that context. Sorry for this. I don't know why that's happening. It's kind of far away from the source, so it shouldn't. To state or restate what you already said at least twice, it's somewhat refreshing that the societal consequences of this kind of research are coming to the fore a little more than perhaps in the past presidency. So there's some hope here that people will understand that although we look at treatment because that's how we make a living, the answer to this is probably prevention rather than fixing it, which might not be fixable after all. Those things. So, but the scientific question, or the scientific point I had for you, if you don't mind, would be to comment on things like Kalen's work, this splitting stress between the stress of threat and the stress of loss, benzodiazepine system based versus opiate based. Those things I would be interested in. Thank you.
Probably the best person to talk about it. Maybe Jaak is in a better position to maybe respond to that. Would you like to say a few words?
Well, I think Dr. Prater knows my work as well as I do, so I think clearly, there's going to be a variety of different neurochemical controls over the overall stress response. And I think the opioids, had a lot of promise that has not been medically fulfilled.
Societally, though.
Pardon?
It's the drug of choice for zillions of people.
Oh, yeah, people on the street that want to regulate their own psychic pain do it very well, but get themselves in trouble because they're addicted. But the system, does have more powerful opioids that are hardly addictive at all, like buprenorphine, because they're mixed agonists and antagonists. And one of the real puzzles is why that one hasn't come into medicine more powerfully. I mean, it came in recently just for narcotic detoxification after it had been used in Europe for almost a decade. So we're a decade behind. But let me kind of highlight one drug that you're very familiar with and wrote a wonderful review article, again, an antidepressant that is being used in Europe. Is a serotonin reuptake facilitator as opposed to inhibitor, and also has direct neurotropic effects on the hippocampus, and doesn't seem to have side effects and seems to be much more effective than the STAR-D SSRIs. Would you care to kind of comment what is the problem? Why don't we have that medicine here?
This is called tianeptine, or the French call it Stabline, and it is very simple reason. The Servier Corporation has never tried to, market it in North America, in part because of sort of a typical French phobia towards Americans. This is a privately owned company. Monsieur Servier is in his 80s and is has perhaps had very strong ideas in the past about this, but they also haven't wanted to invest the money, the huge amounts of money, and they even haven't had the capacity to invest it. And the other part of it is that the real virtues of tianeptine have only been recently sort of fully realized, as you indicated, through both basic studies and also clinical observations. And now the patent has run out. So it's free for anybody to develop it as a generic drug or develop something that can be patented. And so it illustrates the problem that a wonderful drug, which for reasons of maybe personal choice, they didn't try to market, maybe because of hesitancy about dealing with North Americans and so on, and not wanting to spend all the money on it, or even being able to, is now sitting out there as kind of an orphan drug that damn well should be developed. And I know that there are people at Servier and maybe other companies trying to develop a patentable son or daughter of tianeptine that could be used. I also wanted to mention another chemical that we're getting more involved in, namely the endocannabinoids, so marijuana pot, which of course has anxiety-reducing effects, but it can also turn somebody into totally motivationless vegetable, so to speak. And one of the dangers of self-administration of pot is that. On the other hand, its effects are very subtle. It regulates both glutamate and GABA release. And some work that's going on in our lab now has shown that there's only one of the endocannabinoids that is specifically elevated by stress and seems to have very important sort of self-anti-stress properties. And so rather than trying to give the agonist that would bind to all of the receptors in all of the brain regions, looking at inhibitors of the specific enzyme that degrades this one form may be a more targeted pharmaceutical strategy. And so this may have some benefits down the road, but then we have to remember the Romanabant story with the endocannabinoid antagonist that antagonizes the main receptor system, that it worked fine in some people to reduce their motivation to smoke or eat food, but there was a subset of people who took it that became suicidally depressed. So it was taken off the market. And again, it shows the danger, like your remark about oxytocin, that because it's a substance that's involved in so many different things in the brain and body, using it without, modifying in some way, making it more specific, can cause adverse side effects as well.
While I'm moving on to the next question, which is Dr. David Oswald, I'll just point out that anything that elevates mood in France, very dangerous to use it here. It's quite easy to be depressing here.
Just a comment to the audience. I learned something yesterday that I now understand. That is that among a number of things that he's famous for, Dr. McEwen, in academic circles, is famous for not accepting work assignments on weekends. You can't get him to go to a meeting on Saturday or Sunday. Which makes us, of course, more grateful to see him here today on Saturday. A question I had relates to Panksepp and others, the model of separation distress as a basis for depression, the separation distress and the giving up of it. Does that mean that for in your model, it's one of a number of stressors?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to maybe hear Jacques and other people's thoughts about the separation distress in relation to the early childhood adversity, because obviously a kid who grows up in a situation where they do not have a stable parent or other figure in their lives is going to experience some form of, separation distress or lack of fulfillment for having a parental or other figure. And I think I'd like to hear discussion about how those two concepts fit together, because it is, to me, the essence of this early life adversity effect that I was mentioning.
Well, very briefly, I think it's a very underdeveloped concept in a growing field where everyone recognizes that early adversity is one of the precipitating causes of all kinds of problems, including depression. And I think what the separation distress system provides is a concrete pathway that for some reason doesn't appear to be on the minds of most neuroscientists that such a thing exists. But such a thing does exist. I mean, we mapped it out years ago, and I think it was perhaps too long ago when people were not really thinking about the biology of social processes. This idea of there being social mechanisms that are very specific inside the brain only got onto the popular imagination with oxytocin. So, I personally believe that, we already have very effective antidepressants that aren't being used, like buprenorphine. There's enough clinical data that is open trials, but people that have failed every antidepressant medication get immediate relief that they've never experienced with any other medication, and we're not using it. The separation distress idea readily accepts this as, of course, being obvious, because certain kind of depression is characterized by this thing we call psychological pain, psychic pain. And people experience psychic pain primarily when they lose someone, grief, loneliness, and we show that opioids are very powerful in inhibiting the separation distress system. Now, the real paradox is that Giggledine, late Giggledine, he was rather confrontative with this finding because he thought he should have discovered it. And you remember Gig was, and be rather forthright in his desires to.
He did mellow a bit.
He did mellow a bit, yes. But he wanted to challenge this right at the outset, and he did. And he did a very clever experiment with a monkey separation model that he was studying. The person actually doing was Sandy Weiner, who died from cancer a couple of years later. So it's a name that's not on our map, but they looked at the separation response simultaneously with the cortisol release. And lo and behold, the separation response was totally inhibited with very, very low doses, just the way we had found. But the pituitary adrenal axis was not dampened. And therefore they claim PANCEP is wrong. It does not modify this kind of separation distress response. And their assumption was that hormonal measure was more important than the psychological measure. And of course for me, it was just the opposite. It's the psychological pain that characterizes the separation bonding process. The steroid thing merely supports it. But it's very puzzling that there's a dissociation, and maybe you're in a much better position than I am. Has that been developed, or does it need to be looked at once more?
Well, even though I have made my career around studying cortisol, I'm the first one to admit it is not the be-all and end-all of any of this. For one thing, you have forms of depression that are associated with low levels of cortisol and others with high levels. Cortisol is good for you in many respects, as we know, and is part of a pro-adaptive response. And it's also linked to all of these other mediators of allostasis that we can keep expanding upon if you're so inclined. So I think that it reflected the fixation that they had, and unfortunately many people still have, with cortisol as sort of the be-all and end-all, and something that I fight all the time to try to get people to put it in its proper place. Not that it's not important, but it's only part of the story. So I think that their concern was really a non-concern from my standpoint. And what I think is very important is to try to think about ways of, which I'm sure you are, of turning the circuit that you have in mind into something that could be measured in some crude way in some of these people who had this early life adversity, to try to get a better handle on it. I think it's a really interesting challenge.
Dr. Richard Kessler.
Okay. When you were showing some of the slides about the beneficial effects of exercise, my wife poked me a little bit, and my cortisol levels immediately rose. So
that may be good for you.
Well, okay. Well, so this highlighted to me the importance of a word that kept on appearing throughout your talk, which I don't remember from decades ago, and that was the word perceived. Perceived stress, perceived sense of socioeconomic status, so on and so forth. And I thought it was interesting that word was there, and it then suggests that there are limits to how much you can do with those external variables and with large populations, because it's so subjective. The stress, the external situation has to be perceived by the individual. This gets to the subjective issue, which is what we deal with in our offices. It reminds me also the studies of life events. You see the subjectivity in those lists. Also, the top 10 events, I think 6 of them are events that we would consider to be positive. Getting a new house, a new baby, a promotion, so on and so forth. So that brings me to something of political philosophy, which I hope there are no London cabbies here, but so I'll say something about that. So this, to me, points to childhood. Again, people have said things about prevention. When the brain, the formative years of the brain and the mind, when these individual differences are being created. And I saw some of the pamphlets you had up there, some of the PDFs, and I wonder if in fact there is any political will to spend money on prevention. I happened to be in a group of the American Psychiatric Association about 20 years ago dealing with prevention. We heard of wonderful studies, some of which were done in Hawaii and in Texas, about targeting at-risk mothers, mother-infant pairs, and produced incredible results in reducing into the teenage years all kinds of problems with impulsivity and crime and addictions and so on. And there was no political will to spend the money on that, even though the governor at the time was quite impressed with those studies.
Good question. All right. If anybody wants to look up on the Google Nurse Family Partnership, which is a site started by David Olds at the University of Colorado, the Obama administration is very interested in that in particular. It's the basis of programs in the Harlem Children's Zone, although his program is a more direct intervention that is with a skilled nurse social worker who goes into homes voluntarily to help with parenting skills and so on. The Head Start programs that we hear so often about, when they have worked, they have generally been accompanied by a nurse-family partnership or some kind of intervention with the home, because if a kid just goes to school for a couple hours a day and goes home to a chaotic home, it's not going to help very much. So, and many countries like Sweden and the UK and others have that as part of the program. And we, don't systematically do it, although in various states I've heard, there are programs that do it, so although nationally. And I think the Obama administration is very interested in programs like that in terms of the prevention end of things. And you're absolutely right. That's the way to do it. The other part of prevention, it just came out this week, is a report from the Institute of Medicine based upon the National Summit on Integrative Medicine that was held in February at the time that there was the beginnings of the debate of the healthcare reform in Congress. And this was sponsored by the Breakwell Foundation Collaborative. And the report is now available. And its essence was really what integrative medicine is and should be, is the integration of different approaches to prevention as well as treatment, the emphasis on some of the non-traditional ways of often called complementary and alternative medicine, ones that work, and the use of health coaches and other paraprofessionals to work with the medical profession. And there are states and counties in the United States that are beginning to do this. So there is, I think, a will, even though we don't see it always with all the doggone advertising on television about this health insurance reform bill, so-called. But I think there is a will, and whether the will go forward in spite of all the nonsense we're subjected to, I am cautiously optimistic, because even this recent healthcare reform bill that's before Congress has been supported by AARP and the American Medical Association. So even if the insurance companies are trying to kill it, there is still some strong support for it. But even beyond that, at the individual county and state level and community level, there are communities beginning to do this and beginning to show benefits in terms of lower costs. So maybe we can be cautiously optimistic.
Well, as I said at the very outset, what was I going to say? Is that Mr. Frankie's again? We've been going for 18 years more or less, and we really have had many scientists here speaking on their work, from basic neurosciences through to functional systems and applications and whatnot. And I think I can honestly say that this meeting, speaking for myself, and I thought it was only my impression, I've never seen a more kind of seamless transition from the world of the clinical practicing psychiatrist, psychoanalyst, and the basic neuroscience. And that says something, it says a great deal about your work. But I think it also says something about the climate of the era that we're moving into now. So it's really, it's been an enormous pleasure to witness this exchange. Also the exchange with Yard pointing to some of the future directions that are opening up on the basis of this new climate. So thank you, it was a treat, absolute treat. Thank you. Two very quick admin announcements. Our meeting in December is not on the first Saturday of the month. Reset your procedural memory. It's not on the first Saturday, it's on the second Saturday, 12th of December. I know it's going to unsettle you all terribly, you're going to have nightmares, you're going to get lost, but it's on the 12th of December, and our speaker is Maggie Zollner. She's going to talk on the neural bases of motivation and drive and cathexis. And the last one is those of you who are members of our foundation board, you must convene upstairs in the boardroom at what time? 12:30?
Yeah, we can start early then.
12:30 upstairs.
Yeah.
Thank you again to Professor McEwen.